We're going to be starting off in Isaiah chapter 6 today, beginning at verse 1. This is a passage that we should know pretty well. He writes, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one cried to another and said, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory.' And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. So I said, 'Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts.' Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which he had taken with the tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth with it and said, 'Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin purged.' Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?' And then I said, 'Here am I, send me.'" Now, this is a passage that is inspiring, especially when we're trying to find God's calling in our life. We're trying to figure out whether it's an ultimate calling or just an individual task he may have for us. We just feel an urge to be of service to him, and sometimes we just want to cry out, "Here I am, God, send me. What do you have for me? Let me serve you somehow. What is there that you have in store for me?" And that's wonderful and it's important. But there's more to this passage than that. And we see throughout Scripture a lot of visions. And a lot of times these prophets had visions. God would give them a vision that would help them with what they needed to teach the people or explain to the people or help them reach the people. And often it was a vision of destruction. It was a vision of maybe a bowl or a pot pouring out, and it was symbolic of God's wrath pouring out on Israel for turning from him in disobedience and turning to false gods and things like this. But nothing like that happens here. Nothing that seems like a punishment happens. And yet, it almost seems like it breaks him a little bit. Because he says, "Woe is me." And woe is a big word. It's not just a little, "Oh shoot, I feel a little bad about this." They were broken about it. He says, "Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in the midst of a people of unclean lips." And maybe that's not our specific circumstances, but to translate that to what most people's circumstances are is, "Woe is me, because I'm a sinner and I'm surrounded by sinners. I'm surrounded by a sinful world. I'm surrounded by a sinful society that makes it hard to do what's right because I'm constantly influenced by sinful things." God didn't scare him out of that. He didn't threaten a punishment to this point in this vision. What did he do? What was it about this that touched Isaiah so much? And he immediately answers that, "For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." We refer to God's law in Scripture as a mirror sometimes, because rather than just a list of instructions, a list of do's and don'ts, it helps us to see ourselves. It helps us to see the things that are right and wrong in our lives, because it gives us a measuring point. If I look at what God says and I know that I'm not doing that, I can see myself more clearly through his eyes, because I see where I'm failing him. And to see God and to see certain things about him just in recognizing him and in knowing him better, for that to have that kind of impact on him, maybe we need to look a little more in depth in what it is Isaiah saw in God here. What it is that God showed Isaiah about himself, so that we can look at these things for ourselves. And the first thing that I want us to see from this vision is that our God is alive. This vision starts out, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. The king is dead, our God is alive. He was alive before that king was thought of. He was alive before the earth was formed. And he'll be alive long after we're gone from here. He's still alive after King Uzziah died. He'll be alive long after every ruler of this world today is dead and gone to dust. That should give us at least a glimpse of how massive and massively important and magnificent he is, and how small we are. And another thing I want to see is that he was sitting on a throne high and lifted up. God is in authority. He is on his throne. People like to say, I made Jesus the Lord of my life. No, you didn't. He was already the Lord of your life because he's the Lord of everything. The problem is some people just choose not to acknowledge that. And when we do, when we accept that, and we honor him and his authority, we're not fighting him anymore. See, whether we recognize him as Lord or not, he's Lord. So if he's Lord and I don't honor him and I don't recognize him as Lord, then I'm going against him. And once we acknowledge him as that, we might notice some things change. We definitely will. Because we're not fighting him anymore. And that's what people need to realize. He is in authority, whether or not we acknowledge that authority. And it's an ultimate authority because that throne he's sitting on is high and lifted up. You know how many people focus so much on the authorities of this world that their heads spin? They focus so much on what this king or that president or this ruler is doing that it envelops them, and they start to worry about things that they don't need to worry about. Yeah, look at their throne and see what they're doing, because it's important we don't ignore things that are evil in this world, or things that are or good or bad or corrupt or just. Go ahead and look at their throne, but look beyond it and see the one that's above theirs. And once we see how big God is and how big his authority is and how much higher his throne is, they're insignificant. The other ones just look like a bunch of little kids sitting on plastic thrones. Another thing I want us to see is how magnificent God's glory is. Because the Lord that he saw sitting on that throne high and lifted up says he had a train of his robe that filled the temple. Now, what's a train? If you've seen a wedding dress, there's a chance you know what a train is. My wife just went with a friend to go wedding dress shopping. I don't know, maybe you saw a train or two. Historically, they've been a little bit bigger of a train than they probably are today. If you've seen older pictures, especially of maybe a princess or some kind of royalty, you might see a train that goes halfway down the street. Because it's beautiful. It looks like this majestic, royal, magnificent thing. Sometimes I've seen performances where it's often like a hologram or something like that, but a singer will be singing in a dress and the whole stage will look like a giant train of that dress just spread out over the entire thing. And that's what's happening with God's robe in this temple. in this vision, and it's his glory just covering everything. Imagine if God's throne was just above this, and just the train of his robe was just enveloped over this church, over these pews, over this floor, over each of us. But his robe, this majesty, this glory of his, covers the temple. And we need to remember that we are also the temple. And so we might think, oh man, I wish I could see that. I wish I could see God's glory covering over everything that we can. Because we are the temple, and he is in us, and his glory is on us. And we need to live like that. And maybe when we recognize how glorious God is, and know that his glory is upon us and in us, all the little things in this world might seem a little more insignificant. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. I'm going to stop right there for a second, because that's an amazing vision of what this angel, the seraphim, looks like and what he was doing. But I want to look at what he was doing and see what that tells us about God. Why does he have to cover his face in God's presence? The same reason we're not supposed to stare at the sun. Because he's so bright and magnificent and glorious that he can't even look. He has to cover his eyes because it's just too much for him. So much so that he cried out to the other one and said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory." We need to remember that we serve a holy God. You know, it's amazing that we have a God who is all-powerful, who has control of everything, who has the whole world in his hands, who has the power of life and death in his hands. But imagine if he wasn't holy. Imagine if there was someone or something like that out there and he didn't want what's good for us. He was evil. Imagine if there was someone with God's ability but without his heart. How terrifying life would be. And he is infinitely holy, 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 holy. He is infinitely good and so far from evil. Holy means set apart, separated from something to something. And in our senses, being holy is separated from sin in the world and separated to God. He is ultimately separated from the sin of this world. And if the idea of an unholy God is so terrifying, how much of a blessing should the holy God we have be? How much more encouraging should that be? How much should that just lighten our hearts? Because the God who is all-powerful is the God who is fully holy, and we can trust that the one who's in control of everything is good and pure and perfect. So much so that holy, holy, holy is Lord of hosts, and the whole earth is full of his glory, and his glory is a display of that holiness. His glory is what we get to see of and from this holy God. And the seraphim, who is before this God who is so magnificent that he has to cover his eyes. Try driving with your eyes closed first. Don't try it. This is not. If you try driving with your eyes closed for a little bit, I gotta be careful what I say. You'd probably be, in a little danger. Maybe the sun's too bright sometimes, and you got to close them a little bit or shield your eyes. I can't imagine flying with my eyes closed and covered. But God is so holy and so magnificent that he's flying around, eyes covered, crying out how holy God is and how much his glory fills the earth. And it's so impactful. It says in verse 4, "And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke." This angel is so convicted of how magnificent God is that he cries out with such a thundering voice that it shakes the foundation of this throne room God's in. And I don't imagine God as a cheap builder who cuts corners. I've seen a lot of shoddy construction work in my life, and I've seen what happens when people cut corners. And I could spend a half hour telling you some of the crazy stories of things that I've seen that people made so poorly that it wasn't even structurally sound or safe. I can't imagine God build a weak temple or heaven or throne room. But this angel so powerfully belted out how holy God is because he had to. That's what being in God's presence did to him. That it shook the foundations of the room. It makes me think of the most powerful thunderstorm you've ever heard or you've ever been through. I mean, an average thunderstorm, not that big a deal. If you're a little sensitive to it, it might make you a little uncomfortable. Your pets probably freak out a little bit, but every now and then there's that one boom that almost makes it feel like your heart skips a couple beats. Your hair feels like it's standing up on end, and you're just stunned by it, almost like somebody shot off a shotgun right behind your head or something. It just stuns you. It's such a powerful boom, and that's what I think of when I think of this seraphim belting out how powerfully he feels about the holiness of God and how full of this earth his glory is, that it shook the foundations of God's throne room. And that is when he said, "Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." And sometimes that's what it takes. Sometimes it's not a threat of punishment or anything like that. Sometimes we just need to see how great God is to understand how much better we could be doing as an individual or as a person, or as an individual or as a church, as a whole, as a citizen of this world. How much better could we be doing for God? He says, "Woe is me, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." He was surrounded by sin, and that was never more obvious and prevalent. Because what happens when you're surrounded by sin? People get desensitized, and that's why Satan surrounds you with it. It's why he surrounds people in general with it, because they become desensitized and complacent and don't notice it as much, don't care about it as much. But when we're faced with how awesome our God is, there's no denying it. Because the more clearly we see the light of the world, the more clearly we're going to recognize the darkness of this world. And the more clearly we're going to see how much this dark world needs his light and needs us to shine it for him. So what does he do? Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which he had taken with the tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth with it and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin purged." And we know that purification is often equated to fire, or to a cleansing through fire, almost as a refining of gold. And that's what's happening here. He's refining him. He's making this change in him, and he's commissioning him to go out and be this mouthpiece for him. Because these people who didn't get to see the vision, these people who didn't get to see God's glory, these people who were living and feeling the same way Isaiah had been, because as he said, he's one of them, they need to know what he knows. They need to see what he's seen, and he needs to go out and be that voice for him. But as we see, often hearts are hardened. That's what we're going to see in this upcoming passage. Hearts get hardened against God. And sometimes that's because of our own hardening of it. And sometimes God chooses to harden their hearts. He hardened Pharaoh's heart. And I remember the first time I heard that, well, how can he punish Pharaoh if he hardened his heart? But see, the thing is, he didn't take him from a faithful person and make him an evil person through this hardening. He just froze him where he was. And when you work with your hands, when you first start doing it, they're a little more sensitive. They're a little more easily cut up. They're a little bit more easily blistered. And what happens after a while? Start to callous because of the friction, because of the tension. It starts to build up a callus. And when God's calling out to our hearts and reaching out to us, and we keep pushing him away from it, and it keeps causing this friction, it can cause a hardening. And people can become bitter and set against him. We need to pray for a softening of our hearts. Even if they're not fully hardened, I'm sure in some ways our hearts have been hardened to something. Even in little bits. He says, go and tell the people, keep on hearing but do not understand, keep on seeing but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and return and be healed. And it's a hard thing to accept, is the fact that some people are going to just be hardened and they're never going to turn to God. They're never going to seek him. They're never going to turn to him for forgiveness. But we've got to remember that we can't see their hearts like God can. We can't see whether or how hardened their hearts truly are. So we need to be very careful not to think to ourselves, that's a hardened person, I don't need to reach out to them. What's the point? Because we don't know what God sees in their heart and what softening he has in store for them. But it happens, and it's sad. And we see it too much in this world. People that are just so firmly rooted in opposing God that they harden themselves to it. So we see this vision of God, this prophetic vision in chapter 6 that shows us this magnificent, glorious, amazing, perfect, beautiful God. And let's turn to chapter 53. Jesus is God. So all those things that we just talked about our glorious God, our magnificent and holy God, apply to Jesus. And here we see another prophetic word that speaks more specifically to Jesus. They didn't know it yet. They didn't know back then who Jesus was going to be specifically. It says in verse 1, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. Let's stop there for a second. Didn't we just talk about how magnificent and beautiful and glorious God is? And that's who Jesus is. And here he's saying there's no form or comeliness, that when we see him, there's no beauty that we should desire him. He's talking about his physical form. He didn't come down here looking like some movie star or celebrity because he wanted authentic love. He wanted authentic faithfulness. He didn't want to appeal to people on shallow surface levels that, at the end of the day, don't matter. If you're good looking, good for you. There's got to be more than that, and there was with Jesus, we know. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Does that seem like something that is deserved by the one who is on that throne with robe that covers everything and fills the earth with his glory? Does it seem like someone who deserves to be full of sorrow, full of grief, rejected, hated, despised, not esteemed? They didn't care. Some did, a lot did, more didn't. Just like today. And we know it's the narrow road that's following him and the wide road that isn't. And we see in John, let's go to John chapter 12. In John's account of the gospel, in chapter 12 here, Jesus has come to the end of his public ministry. And he's coming on a time where he's putting that to an end, and he's just reaching his disciples, speaking to them, and from there going on, after teaching them, working his way to the cross. John chapter 12, let's begin at verse 37. He's been ministering publicly for 3 years now, traveling all over, reaching people, performing miracles, healing people, teaching them who he was, who God was, what true worship is, what true holiness is. Verse 37, but although he had done so many signs before them, they did not believe in him. And there are so many evidences of God in this world, and we see them, and people don't, and they don't believe in him. In verse 38, that the word of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke, Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? People who read this, people back then who read what John wrote about this, would have looked at this and said, oh, that's what Isaiah was talking about. Because they knew Isaiah. Even if they didn't know Jesus, they knew the writings of Isaiah. And that's the first verse, the first part of Isaiah 53. And they would have looked at that and said, that's who this is connecting him to. He's that man of sorrows. He's that man filled with grief. He's that man that's been rejected by the world. He's this Messiah we've been waiting for. And then John connects it further to chapter 6, verse 39. Therefore they could not believe, because Isaiah said again, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they should see with their eyes, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. And now, not only has he, like in that first passage, connected Jesus to this man of sorrows who they knew was this coming Messiah, now they're connected to chapter 6, and now they're understanding, wait a minute, he's God too. He's this magnificent God that Isaiah had this vision of in chapter 6. These things Isaiah said when he saw his glory and spoke of him. I hope a lot of people read this back then, after John wrote it, and said, wow, Jesus is this Messiah we've been waiting for, and he is this glorious God from chapter 6. And wait a minute, woe is me, I am undone, because I'm a man of unclean lips or sin, and I am surrounded by people of unclean lips and or sin. I hope it made them recognize what they had done to this glorious God and seeing who he really was through this prophecy fulfilled. And I hope it does that for us today. I hope it helps us recognize the importance of faithfulness to God in light of our sin compared to the magnificent God that he is. Why did this happen? I already ruined it for everybody in Sunday school. Verse 42. Nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. You hear what he's saying here? There were a lot of people out there who they believed he was Jesus. They knew he was Jesus. It's Jesus. They believed he was his Messiah. They believed that he was the Son of God. They saw these things and they believed him, but because of those Pharisees, they kept their mouths shut. They kept it within them. They ignored it. They wouldn't confess him because they were afraid of getting kicked out of the synagogue. For they loved, verse 43, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. How much does that happen today? We're afraid of getting kicked out of the synagogue of popularity. We're afraid of getting kicked out of the synagogue of society. You're going to be a weirdo if you believe this God stuff that everybody just knows is fake or whatever. They're convinced. They love the praise of men more than the praise of God. They were more worried about impressing these evil Pharisees than God himself. When God calls me to witness to somebody and I keep my mouth shut, am I more worried about praising God? Am I more worried about the praise of God, or am I worried about the praise of men? Because I might lose that if they think I'm some kind of weirdo. If we really recognize what Isaiah saw, if we really recognize our God for who he is and how magnificent he is, and I believe that everybody here has or does, and sometimes we can lose sight of that. If we keep a focus on how magnificent our God really is, we're going to recognize the darkness in comparison to his light. We're going to recognize darkness in our own lives or around us. Are we going to love the praise of men more, or are we going to love the praise of God more? And Satan knows that. He saw it happen here. He saw it happen when it happened. He read about it afterwards, and he knows it'll keep on working, because if he can just keep convincing people that they're going to be some kind of an outcast for trusting in God or for being faithful to God, that at least some will shy away because they're worried about what other people will think. I'm so thankful that Jesus didn't care what other people thought. I mean, he cares about us, he cares about our thoughts, but he could have said, you know what? I'm not guilty of anything. I'm not going to that cross. People will think I did something wrong. He was humiliated for us. I need to risk a little humiliation for him once in a while, whether that's what it's going to be or not. And because of that, because he was willing to humble himself, that's what he calls us to. He's not calling us to anything that he didn't do. He humbled himself to step out of Isaiah chapter 6 and become Isaiah chapter 53. To step out of this glorious throne room and onto a cross. He leads by example. We need to humble ourselves. As Christians, we need to humble ourselves and not care what this world thinks if it's going to hold us back from being faithful to God's call. And that takes humbling. And we need to remember that we need to love the praise of God more than the praise of man. It takes humbling to go out and speak for him, but we have to also humble ourselves to come to him. Because that only happens when we're willing to admit that we are sinners and we need forgiveness, and we cannot do this without him. If I won't humble myself and admit that if I'm too proud, so proud that I'm like, I haven't been that bad, God, deal with it. You don't like it, send me to hell. I haven't been that bad. No, we need to humble ourselves and recognize that big or small, we've all sinned. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and it takes humbling to turn and say, you know what, God, I can't do this without you. I need your forgiveness. I need your healing. I trust in Jesus. Heal my heart. The Bible says those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And listen, if you'll humble yourself today, if you'll humble yourself in this world, you're going to see a whole lot of exalting, a whole lot of exaltation in heaven, a whole lot of God's glory. You're going you're going to see greater things than Isaiah saw. And you're going to see greater things than you can picture from reading about what he said. We just have to trust in him.